Since Larry told you all about my life, are there any questions? So I guess the question for me, as Mary and Larry posed it, was how did I get involved in ocean conservation, and where do I see it going, and how do you get from point A to point B? First of all, I can only tell you my case, my story. It's certainly different for everybody, and it will be different for you if you choose to go along that sort of route from where you are now to more involvement in conservation, or whatever you get to be involved in. So it's going to be your story, not my story. But I'll tell you my story. I grew up on Long Island. I actually lived in Brooklyn till I was 10 years old. And when we lived in Brooklyn, we occasionally went to the beaches on the south shore of Long Island. Then we moved to the suburbs of Long Island when I was 10. And I grew up there, and I went to the beach and the coast a lot, mainly because two things. First of all, I loved nature. And nature was encountering a lot of bulldozers at that time. And the only place that wasn't bulldozed was from the tide line out. So if you love nature on Long Island and nature was getting knocked down every time you tried to go there on your bicycle, you wound up riding to the coast and seeing nature there. And the other thing I'll tell you is actually part of it, is that I sort of had a phobic hatred of ticks. And whenever I walked around in the woods or the grasslands or the marshes or anything else, I always got lots of ticks on me, and I really hated them. But when I went fishing, I never got any ticks on me. Plus, I came home with dinner. So I started doing a lot of fishing, recreational fishing, that my father and my uncles introduced me to when I was quite small, when I was like 3 years old. So I grew all the way up, well, at least to the 5'5" level, doing a lot of fishing. And I studied the terns, and I started spending a lot of time on the water and becoming much more intimately acquainted. And the other thing that happened was I never really moved far from home. Most people grow up in a certain place, maybe they move far away to another place. Almost all of us have gone far away to college. I didn't. I went to college in a place that looked and felt very different because it was over the bridge off of Long Island, but it was only a 1-hour drive from my parents' house. So I still was back and forth every holiday and quite a bit in between. I could still go right from school to go out to Montauk at the end of Long Island and go surf casting. So I never broke that span of acquaintance. And I loved going to the beach and being in that shallow water and all that stuff so much when I was a kid that I decided that I never wanted to grow up. And so I found this incredible institution called graduate school that could prevent adulthood forever. And I took full advantage of that. So I went to college not far away. Then when I went to graduate school, I went to graduate school at Rutgers, which was just over the bridge, and I was still going back and forth, and I got a job on Long Island that allowed me to actually do my degree on the job while I was working for Audubon, and I was still on the water a lot. So instead of going away to college, away to a different graduate school, doing a postdoc, getting a job someplace, maybe a second job someplace else, and getting lots of really excellent, diverse experience all over the world, I felt like, God, I've never gone any place. I had all these ambitions to be so adventurous, and I always used to say, if I ever do a PhD, I'm going to go to New Guinea, just because it seems so wild. And I never really went anywhere. I was just kind of stuck at home by a combination of circumstances, and most of them were actually very good, because I did a great PhD, as Larry said, that I really enjoyed. It was really a lot of fun, but it was literally, I launched my boat 5 minutes away from my house, and I took a half-hour boat ride across the bay, and that's where I got my data. And because of that, a funny thing happened, was that I had, by the time I just finished my PhD, I had like 30 years of experience watching a place change. And that's really unusual. And the main change that I saw, well, I saw several changes. One is I saw that the trees were all gone and the houses were all there. I saw that the birds of prey that had been demolished during the DDT era were coming back and recolonizing, and I saw that the fish populations were going away, and they were going away rather rapidly and very consistently. And because I did a lot of, well, I used to train hawks, I used to do falconry, so that was very good news, the hawks were coming back. I did a lot of recreational fishing, and the fish were going away, and that was very bad news. Then right around the time I got my PhD degree and finished and graduated, drift nets had moved into the news. There were drift nets in the Pacific Ocean. Drift nets were starting to move around into the Atlantic Ocean. I was thinking that the fishing seems to be deteriorating. I was mainly acquainted with bird literature, and I thought, now that I know how to look stuff up, let me see what is known, if anything is known about what's happening with fish. And so I started seeing that not much was published, but there was a lot in the gray literature, and all the graphs looked the same. They just started high and they went down. And I realized that my experience was a pretty widespread decline. That was not just local, not just because of a few bad years of weather or something like that, but the fish were going away. So I thought, I really like studying terns, I really like studying hawks. I like writing papers and getting them published, but it wasn't really very satisfying, the results of that stuff, because I felt like the world was changing in a way that I felt like I wanted to get involved in, but I didn't know how. And so I started to simply, first of all, talk, which lasted a couple of years, about saying, I think I would like to get involved in these issues somehow. Drift nets seem bad, and I'm really interested in what's going on in the ocean, and I'd like to be involved in this issue, but I really just had absolutely no idea how to do that. So I found out that a local sport fishing group wanted to hire somebody to be like a lobbyist, and I didn't think they had enough money to do that, so I said, listen, if you just pay me for like 1 day a week, I'll start helping you on some of these issues which they've been working on. That had to do with striped bass regulations, when they were trying to get new regulations in place to help prompt the striped bass to start recovering. On Long Island, there are these shallow bays where weak fish come in to spawn in the springtime, and a lot of people were gill netting them as they were coming onto their spawning beds, so we tried to stop that. And it was a few local things, and that lasted for about a year or so. And that was good because we started to actually see some success from those efforts. I started writing occasional pieces on fish conservation, mostly, for a weekly newspaper that was mostly fishing reports that came out on Long Island. That was how I started getting some sense of writing for a different audience, with, that was not a science audience, certainly by a long shot. And the good thing about those early experiences was that I got a lot of positive reinforcement because the things we were doing actually worked. So it encouraged me to continue to do that. And I wanted to start based on those positive experiences, I wanted to start a ocean conservation program aimed at fish and fisheries within the context of my employment at that time, which was working for the National Audubon Society. Now, I thought that there were a couple of things I wanted to accomplish, but the first thing I needed to do was just see if anybody that I worked with was interested in working on these things. So we had a meeting in my kitchen with 3 people, I think. One of them was he was, what was he called? He was like the managing editor of Audubon magazine. And he was really good communicator. So at one point he said to me, all right, Carl, stop. What do you want people to know or think? And I said, well, everybody just catches fish. And to me, fish are wildlife. And he said, okay, that's it right there. That's really the goal of the whole program, is to get people to think of fish as wildlife. So that became, I have to say, like, you know, it's a slight exaggeration, but only a slight one, to say that for the next 5 years I earned my entire living by saying fish are wildlife to lots of people who never thought of it that way. Up until that time, people really only thought of animals in the ocean that had gills and fins as commodities. There was a campaign to conserve the fish stocks when the foreign boats were demolishing them off of the U.S. coasts in the 1960s and 70s. And that resulted in the Magnuson Act, pushed our boundaries out to 200 miles. But that was all about keeping the fish for us to catch, and actually resulted in us depleting the fish much farther than they had ever been depleted before. Then there was a big push to stop whaling, and many people saw the whales as wild animals, not as commodities. After the whaling ban went into effect in 1986, there was a sort of a lesser push to do something about the sea turtle drownings in the shrimp trawls off the southeast coast of the United States. And other than save the whales and save the sea turtles, no conservation groups had ever been involved in ocean fish management or conservation at all. They just had not. So one of the things that I first wanted to do was go around to the different groups and say, hi, I'm from National Audubon, and I would like to talk to your staff about ocean fisheries, because I think we all need to start working together on this. And I would go in, and 4 people or 6 people or a dozen people would sit around the table, and I would say, fish are wildlife too. And they would say, oh, you know what, we never really thought of it that way. And I showed lots of graphs showing them what you couldn't see by looking. You could see that the bulldozers are knocking the trees down. You could see other things happening on land. If you looked at the ocean, you could not see that it looked any different. So it seems quaint now, but it came as news at that time. And I was unusual because I was like the only person in a conservation group who had stayed in one spot for 30 years watching fish decline. And then I just said, hey, the fish are declining. That became my entry into ocean conservation. I began to work with some people in a few other groups that were lawyers. We worked on a lot of policy stuff together. We worked on a campaign to save bluefin tuna, and we did a tremendous amount of work, and we had some early wins and some horrible reversals, and ultimately, at this point I will say we totally lost on that. We got the first regulations for sharks in place. We constructed a complete overhaul of the Magnuson Fisheries Act that resulted in the Sustainable Fisheries Act of 1996. That's more or less the law that we have right now that mandates recovery plans and other things. So I did lots of that policy work for quite a while, but I was also really interested in communicating these things to wider audiences, new audiences, especially outside the choir, as I used to say. So I began to, I sort of stopped doing real science work, and I started writing for some policy journals. I started writing for, occasionally for some magazines like Scientific American about these issues. It helped get the idea and the issues across to lots of new people and new audiences. And then I came out with a book that got published right at the very beginning of 1998. And at that time, lots of people then were working on fish policy. So I started focusing more on what I could uniquely do and how people were responding to me, which was more as a communicator and a writer. So I tried to focus more of my attention on writing since that time. I think it's still important to be involved in some policy things as a reality check and as a real sense of the field, to have an authentic feel for things. So I don't really think of myself as a science writer at all, although I write about science a lot. I think of myself as a person who writes about things I've been involved in, or things that come very close and very naturally directly off of things I've been involved in. Most of my work for the last few years has been trying to explain how the oceans are changing and what those changes mean for wildlife and for people. And it's always kind of surprising that people have responded pretty well to my efforts to do this, and I get all these accolades and people see me as very successful and all this kind of stuff. I don't really share that view. I'm very happy, and it is very satisfying that I've accomplished a few things, but there's a lot of stuff that I would like to do that I have not accomplished. There are lots of books that I would like to write that I probably will never get around to writing. And I find myself right now trying to figure out a different way of telling this story rather than doing the fourth book more or less in that series. It was never conceived as a series, but it turned out to be more or less a three-part way of doing the same kind of thing from different angles, trying to figure out how to do something that is the right thing now that's a little bit different, which I think, as I'm groping toward it, is more of a sense of the moral and ethical and spiritual dimensions of what we've learned scientifically and what the implications are to people who, for other values that we hold, for the moral values that we hold, and for people who live not according to scientific values, but according to religious values and things like that. But I'm still groping around on that. So I think in a really quick sketch, those are sort of the high points of my work as I sort of scan back quickly over the last 15 or so years. I don't know, maybe Mary and Larry, if there's anything you know about me that you think I didn't highlight that would be worth talking about, I can talk about that, or any other questions anybody has, or
I have one which may spark some interest. A lot of the people in this room are going to end up working for government or non-governmental organizations, and you've been in two at Audubon and forming your own. So I was wondering.
I've been around a lot also. I've been on the funding side a little bit too.
We spent about an hour in the car on the way here talking about the dysfunctional relationship between NGOs and things like that. So anyway, I was wondering if you might say something about life in the NGO and the upside and the downside.
Okay. Well, the downside first. The downside of working in most non-governmental organizations. Now, non-governmental organization covers almost everything there is, really. I mean, a business is a non-governmental organization. Most colleges and schools are non-governmental organizations. This is a non-governmental organization, but that's not what's usually meant. What's usually meant is an advocacy group. And the downside to those stems largely from the fact that you are on a continual fundraising treadmill that takes a lot of time away from real work. And because you're on a fundraising treadmill, it increases the incentive to distinguish yourself from other groups in a competitive rather than a cooperative way. So with some rare exceptions, and almost all the rare exceptions are very good ones, many of the advocacy groups act somewhat or very competitively toward each other and don't get to organize very well together for the common benefit of the mission. And when they do, which is not that unusual, it usually works much better and very well and it feels better, and ironically it's usually better for raising money also. But because people are people, they tend to see a little short term even in those groups. And so rather than saying, look, if we subsumed a little bit of our own credit-taking profile and we worked with other groups, wouldn't it look like we were all succeeding, and wouldn't that help us all raise money and stay in business? Because it would. Many people don't think quite that far. There's certainly a range in the conservation world. There's a range of groups that I see. It ranges from the humane groups on one end, whose main imperative at the extreme is preventing animal cruelty. Some of that I think is very misguided, and some of it I have a lot of sympathy for. On the other extreme are like the really big international conservation groups like Conservation International and the World Wildlife Fund. I tend to think that the big groups do better work, even though they often are less efficient in using a dollar for their programs. I often think they can hire better people, they do more professional work, they get more accomplished. So I tend to like and gravitate more toward the bigger groups. And the plus side to me is that the other downside is that the dark forces, the forces of greed, who the advocacy groups are largely set up to work in the public interest, and the forces of greed and darkness work in their own self-interest against the public interest often. But because we have a very corrupt system in this country of campaign contributions and finance that gigantically skews and helps simply install people who are shills for who has paid for their campaigns, they have conspired to enact legislation that says that groups that act in the public interest cannot lobby the government. And they can only do so for about 20% of their time, or they risk their nonprofit status. That dissuades a lot of groups from doing the work that would make them more effective. So a lot of the advocacy groups are just always trying to raise the profile of the issue, but they're afraid to connect the issue to the politicians because it's against the law to do too much of that. Meanwhile, it's not against the law for special interests to just hire full-time lobbyists who march all over the Capitol and just swarm in there like what would be a good analogy? Like fire ants in a sea turtle nest. But the good side of working in the NGOs is that they are really mission-driven. They're not profit-driven. You have a sense, or at least the opportunity to have a sense, that you're working on stuff for the right reasons, that the work is usually worth your time. Unlike many businesses in highly competitive fields, you feel like there's not enough of you to go around, and what you're doing contributes to something that needs to be done and is actually worthwhile. If you were working for Coca-Cola, how could you possibly feel that way, knowing that if Coca-Cola went out of business, Pepsi would sell all the cola to whoever wants cola? I mean, it's sort of like the whole thing is pointless, and it's just all about self-preservation of these businesses. That is not the case in the nonprofit world, especially in the larger groups. Some of the really small groups do sort of get stuck in a cycle where they kind of have to justify their own existence. But it's not really that way in the bigger groups. In the bigger groups you have, and many of the smaller groups, you have the feeling that you're doing something because you think it's right, you think it's worthwhile, and it's what you want to work on. So there's also a refreshing ability to be a little bit nimble. They're less bureaucratic, certainly, than being in the government. The government can be a very, very frustrating place. You can get very bogged down working in government. But some people thrive in working in government. Some people thrive in working in academia. Some people thrive in working on law and legislation. Some thrive in being communicators. And I think that it's the most important thing in guiding your own path and your own decisions is to figure out what you want to do and what you can do naturally, what comes naturally to you, rather than trying to be like somebody or like something if you just don't have those kinds of skills or talents and you're trying to force yourself or browbeat yourself about it. It's a lot better. You'd be more effective and happier and everything else to try to figure out what comes naturally to you. Now, having said that, I think it's important to be among people who are giving you a real run for your money and that you don't feel too comfortable with. If you don't feel like you're stretching to the edge of your ability all the time, then you're not really growing very much, and you're less likely to be really motivated and challenged and contributing a lot if you're just in some cozy little downscaled spot. But if you have no aptitude for math, you probably shouldn't be working on constructing models. But but if you have some aptitude and you want to do modeling and you're not sure how and you find it very daunting, then you should do that. You should be in a situation that you find very scary. But if you find it unnatural and strange and completely not up your alley, you should probably go down another alley. So, yes.
Do you feel that your PhD was
Yes.
useful and or necessary for your
Every day. The silliest thing anybody ever says to me, and people have said this a few times, is they say, I'm thinking of getting a PhD, but I want to do what you do. And I obviously, I do have a PhD, and I didn't stop using it. I didn't use it in a formal academic setting, but when I look at things written by science writers, I often think that their writing is rather poor and superficial, and I suspect it's because many science writers really have no experience being scientists. They don't really understand the texture of science. I don't think they read science papers in the same sort of intimate way of feeling like, if you are a scientist or you have been a scientist, you do a PhD, reading science papers is your stock in trade. It's not some strange thing. And one of the big problems with all the decisions that we've made that are so bad is that the science is not connected to the decision making. Part of the reason it's not is because decision makers don't understand science. They are scientifically illiterate. And many scientists are illiterate in simply speaking plain English in a way that they can communicate outside their field. But many decision makers who should be basing their decisions on science don't know and don't value what science has to say. And I feel that my approach to writing, even my approach to writing narrative books, I usually have in mind the structure of a scientific paper, which I think is a very effective structure, and I'll tell you why I think it makes my writing different from some other kinds of writing. In a science paper, you have an abstract, which basically says, here's what we're going to talk about. It's like the guy that got up on the stage before Shakespeare's plays and would give you sort of an overture about what would happen, what you were about to see, about the tragedy of the Capulets and the Montagues, and then he would go off, and then the play would start. So he would just given you the abstract. Then there's the introduction section, which is you set the context for the scene. You think about, I need to explain this in a context. How am I going to tell this story in the context of what we know and what's going on and the state of the art and of the field? Then there's the results section. The results section is, here are the facts as I have learned them. This is the data. The data in a laboratory tends to be stuff that you measure and quantify in numbers. The data in certain other kinds of things, and even in some real science, is what you find in talking to people. If you're studying, we were talking about this, if you're studying traditional fisheries management of some island culture that has an oral history and nobody was there taking any data for a long time, then actually what people tell you is as close as you're going to get to the facts as you understand them. So you put that in the results section, and you don't mess with the results right then and there. You just display the results. These are my measurements, these are my facts as I found them. This is what I will now talk about. Then you have the discussion section, which is, this is what I think these facts mean. And then you have the conclusion, which is, after analyzing the facts and what I think they mean, here's what I think the conclusion is. Here's what I think we really have learned. Here's what I think advances this little piece that I have taken. I think that a lot of writers who approach issues have the they have the approach, and I think it's a weakness, of trying to lobby the reader, trying to say, believe this, and this is my opinion, and here's what I want you to think. And that's all. The whole books are written like that. Even books about the environment are written like that. And it's up to the reader then to think, do I trust the writer? I can't really see why the writer has come to this conclusion. I have to take their word for it. Do I like them? I don't know why they concluded this exactly. I kind of get it from what they're writing. But what I try to do is just like you do in a science paper. I try to leave the facts alone so that you can see it, so that the reader can sort of come along with you and then explain my take on them and what I think it means for what has to be done. But now, obviously, you could say, well, that's completely biased because it's your own view, and it's my writing, and I can't do too much better with that aspect of it, other than to say, here are the facts as I understand them. Here's how I came to understand these facts, and here's what I think they mean. And I hope that by doing that, of course, I hope that the reader agrees with me. I don't want the reader to disagree with me, but I want them to understand. I mean, I'm writing these things because I think they're real and important, so I want them to understand how to get there along with me. And you know, I would say, like, my PhD is involved in every step of that whole process, in addition to reading all the science papers that go along with it.
Maybe just rephrase, a lot of us are in the MEM program, and some of us are considering going on to do a PhD, and a lot of people have aspirations to be at or near the type of work you do at some point in terms of influencing management policy decisions.
Right.
So do you feel that a PhD, both in the training you get and having the degree itself, are necessary for where you are?
Well, they're necessary for where I am, because they're really a big part of my story and my approach. Mm-hmm. Could I have done what I did without it? I couldn't have done it. Now, there are other people who are, you know, equally, quote, successful, or certainly successful, or a lot more successful, who don't have PhDs and write about these kinds of issues, but not me in my case, in my story. It was really important to me that I do and understand science. It's how I came to discover the information I discovered. It's what made me original at that time. I found it out. I didn't read about it. And partly I found it out just by going fishing for fun, but partly I found it out because my PhD showed me where to start looking and digging for unpublished great literature reports. So you can get derailed from that kind of work with a PhD, certainly. You know, you can find yourself in a track that leads to a much more academic thing and a much more research-oriented thing. But that, you know, not everybody. People are good at different kinds of things. So you may find in the course of doing a PhD that that's what you really, really like. You know, better than anything is the kind of research that you do during the course of that. So I do think it's largely an individual thing. I don't hear anybody saying, God, I wish I had not gotten a PhD. You can do very well. You can do very well without it. You can make a lot of valuable contributions without it. You can do very good work without it. Many of my most respected and esteemed colleagues don't have PhDs. Some of them have law degrees. Some of them have masters and are doing really great work that I admire a lot. But it is certainly true that for certain kinds of work and certain kinds of jobs, you simply need a PhD to apply. It just opens a lot of doors pop open that you didn't even realize were closed to you. And then, you know, in a stack of applicants, it gets you past a lot of them just because you have the added training. That's a plus. It does take a lot of time and a certain different kind of attention for those years that you're doing it. That might be a minus in a way. To me, I think it was a big plus, I would say, I don't know. And what else was I going to say about that? Oh, the world does look at you differently, oddly enough. As soon as I got my PhD, I noticed that my status really changed in the eyes of people, and they were wrong because I hadn't changed that much and I hadn't learned that much. I hadn't done that much. But I really got startled once, right after I finished, like within maybe 3 months, I was called to testify in a little congressional panel. You know, it's calling testify in Congress. It sounds really big. You just go down and in one of their hearing rooms is usually a few congressional members. They've called a hearing about some issue or other. In this case, what it was there was a congressman from some coastal state, Virginia or Maryland. He wanted to introduce a bill to help protect America's coastal barrier islands. And he was trying to stack a little hearing with people who would say that that was a great idea and help push it forward. So he called National Audubon Society and talked to the science vice president, who delegated it to me to write some testimony about what it, how islands are really threatened and they have a high percentage of endangered species and it's a good idea to protect them, and go and do this at this hearing. So I went, and there are 6 people that get 5 minutes to give their little testimony, and then they ask you questions, and that's the hearing. And I was maybe last or next to last, and the first person went, and the congressman was saying, "Well, Ms. Smith, what do you think about that?" And, "Well, Ms. Smith, what do you think about this?" And, "Well, Ms. Smith, don't you think that if this happened, then that?" And then the next person, and it was, "So, Mr. Brown, what you're saying is this, that, and the other thing." Then when he came to me, he said, "Well, doctor, so your opinion is," and I realized that this PhD thing had a certain amount of gravitas attached to it, not attached to me, but attached to it, because I was that was the first time I'd ever done anything like that, and I felt very, very wet behind the ears, and I was quite young, and I had no policy experience at that time. But I just really took notice, and obviously I still remember that it was that really meant something to how I was viewed all of a sudden. And I thought, well, I'll go with that, why not? I feel it works. I typed all those pages, I learned something about nature, and if that's good for them, it works for me.
How do you decide at the Institute what projects you want to work on? In other words, do you identify something that you feel is an issue and then say, write up the issue and then seek out grant money to work on it? Or do you respond to requests for proposals that come across your desk? Or how do you, with all the issues there are out there to work on, how do you sift through and decide what direction?
Well, it's a very, very imperfect process. And what we do is we have a few sort of filters that we apply to things that come up as opportunities or possibilities or thoughts. First filter is we want to work at a national level at least. So if it's not a project that can affect people at a national level or can talk about an issue at a national level, then we don't do it at all. There's only one exception to that, which was we have a partnership with a local aquarium that's based on Long Island. They just gave us money. It's a contract. They gave us money to employ somebody that goes out on a tour boat with school groups. So essentially they use us as their naturalists. And that's strictly Long Island based. It has no national implications. And I keep saying we need to use this to develop a more national level educational program, which we don't really quite have right now, educational for people like teens and younger. So that exception aside, we just say, is this a national thing? And then we say, is there something original we can add? Do we see a way that we can have an effect on the issue? And are we reaching new audiences by doing this? So that's how we discuss new possibilities. For instance, one that we've been wrestling with for a while is certainly climate change has really, kind of overshadowed all other environmental concerns. It kind of lays itself right on top of everything you're concerned about. If you're concerned about fisheries, climate change will affect fisheries also. If you're concerned about forests, if you're concerned about croplands, water, whatever it is, anything that's an environmental issue, you sort of have to think now of the climate change dimension. And it's likely, I think, that will remain the case for the rest of our lives. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope climate change turns out to be the Y2K of science. But I have to say that the first time I heard about the Y2K problem, I thought, this is bull. This is completely not true. And every time I've tried to look at climate change in a way that says, the consensus of thousands of scientists around the world is flat out wrong. I can't convince myself of that. It does seem more and more, whenever I go out in the field with any scientist, they're always talking about some aspect of climate change that is affecting what they're doing. So I think it'll be here for a long time. So the thing is, for us, if we're an environmental group and we want to affect things in an important way, and climate change is the most important conservation issue, is there any way we can get involved in this and make an original contribution that has a real effect on anything? And it's been a very daunting question. But we recently have come up with something that I think is actually an answer to that. But without going through those filters, we would have just started writing, op-eds about how climate change is bad, or do some reports that are reviews, and we publish some reports. Lots of environmental groups, they just do these reports and then they self-publish them, and they just try to get people to read them and stuff like that. I've always thought that way of doing things is not very good. Another thing we've always focused on is real publishing in real publications, which many NGO type groups hardly do, or don't do it all. Some don't do it all. So those are the kinds of filters that we apply. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was wondering, it seems that in the U.S., conservation and sustainability, these sort of ideas are still sort of in a niche and small minority. And in your opinion, what do you think is the best way to bring that into the public, change that, should make things into a common mentality?
Well, I have been asking myself that question for about 20 years, and not like only in the shower, but the whole time I'm working. And if I had a very effective answer to that, we would all be doing a lot better with these issues. But it's obviously still a big problem. And I think that part of the answer can be, and the part that I'm trying to work on, is that people seem pretty clearly to not react to information. There's so much really good information that really tells us everything we need to know to improve things drastically. It doesn't tell us everything we need to know about every issue or everything we need to know about the whole solution. But to get from where we are now to a place that's much, much better, we already have all the information we need to know to do that. Whether it's fisheries or energy or anything. And people don't talk the language of information or the language of science. Most people don't at all. Many people do a little bit, but many people are driven by what, like, their religions tell them is moral behavior or ethical behavior or what they should do. Other people are driven by how they can profit from it. Some people are driven by concern about their health. And finding ways of not telling people, put down your interest for a minute and look here at what I want to show you, but saying, how can I be a translator to understand how these things link with these different interests and craft messages that go right into those open conduits that are how people assimilate information and a sense of what they should be doing and how they should be valuing or evaluating things. So, for instance, on this climate change issue, that the answer that we came up with for ourselves is we have seen an opening and we have started to work on an opening, and it's working very well right now, of talking to certain Christian evangelical leaders about the moral implications of climate change, because we believe that there are moral implications from a strictly secular scientific point of view, and we understand the information from science better than the pastors who don't read science papers and things like that and get a lot of mis and disinformation. So we can help them understand what science really says about this, and we can help tell them and explain how the world is changing. But People look to scientists as scientific authorities. They don't look to scientists as moral authorities. And millions of people look to religious leaders as moral authorities. So, and they craft their whole lives and how they vote, most importantly, in this country, most importantly, how they vote accordingly. So by building this bridge across this terrible polarized divide that we've had that I think has been so destructive, and building it mainly around climate change, but with a lot of other things that could be affected and improved, I think we have a way of making an original and potentially a significant sort of contribution on the climate change front. So that's a thing that we've started working on. That's a new project, and we're trying to look for money for that project, which I think will be quite available. Initial indications are there's lots of interest in funding those kinds of things, and we've started a little bit on it. You can see, if you go to my blog, your fault, your fault.
3 years later.
Yes. Well, all right, you were right. Okay, shut up.
I'm not going to rub your face.
You were right. Shut up.
But it took a lot of control.
You'll see a trip that we took with some scientists and some evangelical leaders up to Alaska this summer to look at the effects of climate on people and wildlife and habitat.
Do you ever worry that many of the mitigation techniques, like carbon sequestration, involve the ocean, and that we could, initially experiment with all these techniques and cause a lot of harm?
Oh, certainly. Yes.
Do you think, where do you sort of stand? Do you think we should wait, and so we know more? Or
I don't know enough about the technicalities of those things to have a very informed answer. But basically, I think that there's kind of been a rush to create these experiments without asking all of the right questions about them. But much more fundamentally, I hate the idea that we will take climate change as such a given that we're not even going to do anything to develop new sources of energy, which really, basically we're doing nothing in this country about that. And we're just going to start erecting seawalls, we're going to throw iron in the ocean, we're going to just let the world heat up, which is going to be so much worse than anything else, and we're going to try to get used to it, we're going to try to beat the sea back, we're going to try to turn our air conditioners on, and stuff like that, because I don't think we're going to throw enough iron anywhere in the ocean to cool the planet down. We will wreck all those ecosystems in the ocean that are, based on oligotrophic environments it's like saying we're going to take all the deserts. The deserts are no good for anything, so we're going to plant rainforests on all the deserts. Well, that might be okay, but it would destroy deserts as a habitat, and there's a lot of things live in the ocean that depend on clear blue water where there's not a lot of plankton. That's just where they live. They happen to include tuna and other things of minor value to millions of people. So I don't like those kinds of things that say we're just not going to fix the problem. We're just going to band-aid the problem with a bunch of tacked-together solutions that we don't really understand very well. Now, I may be distorting the seriousness of those techniques, but that's how they strike me at this point. Yes?
How do you think this kind of consciousness about things being in danger and the great need for conservation? Right now, even with the drought, people don't really take it seriously because you can turn on water and there's still water coming out of the pipes. You know that there are certain tunas and fish in danger, but you can still go to the store and buy them. So how do you think outreach really needs to go about to make people understand that this really is a serious issue?
Yeah, well, that's obviously really hard to do, because some people respond to those kinds of things, and many people just don't seem to. They're like, and I think especially in the U.S., where people just are so accustomed to getting anything they really want, everything they really need for the most part. There are very poor people in the U.S., but for the most part, the U.S. is an insanely rich place with just an incredible amount of waste going on, people taking lots and lots of things for granted. And it's like people who are out of control with their bank account and just say, as long as I'm still spending money, it's not a problem. But they're going to run out of money at that rate. So I don't have the silver bullet for making people understand that. One thing I have seen again and again, and this is really bad, is that people argue about it and deny it, whatever the problem is. They argue over the problem and they deny the problem until the problem becomes undeniably bad. When everybody runs out and is really suffering, is going out of business, then at that really, really late hour of the day, people get together and at gigantic expense and huge social dislocation and everything else, then they work together to fix the problem, which would have been so much easier to avoid or so much easier to fix years earlier if people thought precautionarily and took warnings to heart and were, a little more thoughtful about things. But we have, I was at a conference recently in Aspen, and this phrase, catastrophic failures of leadership. And we have that. We have catastrophic failures of leadership. We have terrible leaders in a faulty political system to begin with that is capable. The problem with our political system is capable of doing magnificent things, but it's also capable of doing awful things. We're at the awful end of the spectrum. And to quote a colleague of mine, David Wilco, he says, "When men like this cast long shadows, it must be pretty late in the day."
In terms of Western Atlantic bluefin tuna, what do you think is the worst part of either management, policy, or fishing practices?
The worst part is that they didn't listen to me all these years. That is by far the worst part, because I told them so a long time ago, and if they had done it, we would be in good shape. The worst part right now is that for many years, the quota was caught every year, and then even after they raised the quota repeatedly in the late 90s of all times, they would overshoot the quota, but in the last 5 years or so, they can't catch the quota, and the fish are disappearing so rapidly that last year they only caught 10% of the quota, the U.S. fishermen fleet. But the fisheries service is not shutting down the fishery. They still allow fishing in what is now a well-identified, thanks to Barbara Block's work, well-identified spawning area in the Gulf of Mexico. We always knew they spawn in the Gulf of Mexico. Now we know a lot better when and exactly where they are. We still allow long lining in there. We still allow them to keep one bluefin per trip. They cut others off dead. They probably sell others illegally. And with a population that's crashing at that rate, to go into the breeding aggregation of the last remaining breeders and keep fishing on it, not accidentally, because for 2 years I've had a lawsuit against them to close it, and they've stonewalled and done everything to just just avoid any need to act on it. And now they say we need a 3 to 5 year moratorium on bluefin fishing in the Mediterranean and East Atlantic Ocean. So that's a way, to me, that's completely cynical and ridiculous, because it's a way to say to U.S. fishermen, it's not our fault, we should still keep fishing, but those bad foreigners over there need to be shut down. And then you go to the meeting, the international meeting, and you say, we want some and we want you to have none. And that's not a conversation starter. But that's U.S. policy on an issue where a giant ocean animal, imagine if there was a 1,000-pound animal on land that had declined 98% in the last 20 years, and you were still hunting them where at the end of their migration where they go to breed. That would not happen anymore these days. They would have been on the endangered species list a long time ago. The critical habitat and the spawning area would have been declared and everything else. And we are just driving them extinct. And it's, the U.S. policy on this, in the face of all of the information that mainly American scientists develop, is just completely negligent and criminal. It's illegal because the law says that they have to give U.S. fishermen the opportunity to catch the quota, and if they're catching 10% of the quota because they're destroying the fish, they're not giving them the opportunity to catch the quota by driving them extinct. So it's just a really, really negligent policy. Yep.
Do you think that if you started some sort of advertising campaign across the nation about how bluefin tuna is a sexy species, like dolphins getting caught in the tuna net, how that campaign stopped people wanting to eat, stop kids who were I only want to eat dolphin-free.
Right.
I mean, you think you could start that kind of campaign saying about bluefin tuna?
Well, I kind of feel like you kind of can't, because people don't relate to them the same way that they relate to dolphins. And yet, that approach actually worked well with swordfish.
You guys know there's a class in here in about 2 minutes?
Okay. Yeah.
There's a class in here right now, actually.
I just wanted to make sure everybody.
Okay. We'll move out.
So I guess we're done. But it worked with swordfish. And as a result of that, and some support, a chef boycott that was very well publicized, a consumer boycott and everything, and helped along by a lawsuit that we did to close certain areas where juveniles congregated. Those fish are recovering now, and there are a lot more of them than there were 10 years ago. So I do think that can help, actually.
I mean, what about working with chefs in addition to evangelical?
Can we pause this and take a public comments to get back here at SBSO?
If you want to buy a book from Carl, he has it here for $10.
Do you think it's open?
That approach did work with swordfish, and it was tried again with Chilean sea bass. I don't think it worked as well with Chilean sea bass, but I don't think it was organized nearly as well from the publicity angle either.
Yeah, what about the chef side of things and getting into the restaurant industry?
Well, I agree with you. I think that's a good angle, and we are working on that, and we're working with certain chefs who are trendsetters. We're working to try to develop a chef's curriculum that can go to chef schools that give at least a lesson or two about sustainable seafood, for the purpose of making chefs think it's part of their profession to think along those lines, not something that you learn maybe afterwards. So I think you need to work at all these different levels on a lot of things. I don't think that there's one way that's going to fix anything. And even if there's one best way, it's not going to do the whole thing. So you have to work at different levels, different people, different audiences, different approaches, different ways of talking. That's what I think.
Where do you think the marine conservation movement is going?
I would say Pennsylvania. DC is going to get flooded.
Well, yeah. So especially in the wake of climate change, not the physical threat, but just the fact that all of our focus is shifting to.
Well, the conservation in general, if you think back a ways, and this is partly the facts of conservation, partly the conception of conservation. Even when I was in graduate school, people thought that they could study natural systems and nature, and people thought that conservation was about things like putting mooring buoys on coral reefs so that boats wouldn't drop their anchors, and quaint things like that. In fact, wildlife management for the better part of probably 30 years was about creating edge habitat to bring back deer from the brink of extinction. It's hard to believe that white-tailed deer were actually almost extinct. Something like, if I remember this correctly, something like 60 years passed from the time a white-tailed deer was shot in New Jersey to the time the next one was seen in New Jersey. If I'm right about how I remember that fact. And that was the whole thing about wildlife management, like create habitat so deer can come back, and then it was about anchors on coral reefs and things like that. But now I think it's really clear that you can't go anywhere and just study nature. That's why that really seminal book about climate change, The End of Nature, is titled The End of Nature, because it's like people thought that forests were natural, and they realized, well, forests are a lot different now than they used to be because of land practices and things like that. But everybody always thought the weather was natural, but now we realize that not even the weather is natural as we understand it now. So I think that as this program amply illustrates, people who are interested in nature and the environment realize right from the basic concept of what that interest means nowadays, that it means being involved in management and interventions. It's a lot more about people, and I think it will increasingly be a lot more about people. You could think you were working on nature and conservation just by working on natural things or like land management. But so much of it now is about how to deal with the dynamics of communities that are pivotal in whether local areas will be saved or managed or maintained or exploited, or whether people will resent conservation efforts or embrace them. So a lot more of it has to do with cultural imperatives and how you work with people and how you provide for the future of people in an area that where you really just see your job as trying to preserve the natural aspects or some wildlife population. But unless you think about the prospects for the people in the future, you're likely not to really do a thorough job of securing the place and investing them and making it seem like they are in a position to take it from there and bring new people into it themselves. I think that the climate challenge is very, very daunting. It erases anything that used to look like a way of describing working in marine conservation. I used to say, I work from the high tide line down. And of course, we always knew that the land and sea are connected, but that is just completely blurred now because climate effects on sea level, on temperatures in the water, the ranges of organisms, the ability of animals with calcium carbonate shells to exist or withstand, or who knows, maybe adapt in some bizarre way to the reduction in pH. All these things are, they're big issues, and that's what, yes.
I was going to ask about the climate change issue because it does seem to be subsuming everything. But it seems like there are some more direct issues, including many of the ones you worked on, about simple things like overfishing.
Yeah, well, I was getting around to that.
We don't know how to fix climate change, and it's almost distracting people.
Well, here's my
things they can't fix.
Yeah, that's what I was going to actually go to was right there. That I think that the climate issue, it's the new issue, and it's the one that is distracting. Well, it's occupying a lot of attention. Finally, very belatedly, it's occupying a lot of yes, and it's very important that it is. But I think that the pendulum will swing back a little bit so that people understand that it's not just either you fix climate change or we all simply die and everything goes down with it, but that there are lots of other things we can do in the meantime And climate will have a big effect on certain things, and climate needs to be considered in certain issues. But you can fix, the issue of bycatch of albatrosses has nothing really to do with climate change. And you can fix that. You can catch fewer fish and you can let fish populations recover, even if their ranges are going to change because of climate change. You still have to work on a lot of these things that we have come to understand as real issues. They're not, they may be overshadowed, but just because they're in the shadow of climate change, just because they will be affected by climate change, does not mean that you can't do anything for those issues. You shouldn't try, you shouldn't keep doing it, or you can't improve things a lot, even if the climate situation is not what you're working on and doesn't quite get fixed. I don't think it will get fixed. I think a lot of things will change. I would hate to be an alpine specialist in the lower 48 right now because I think that no matter what you do for pica conservation at this point, those things are gone. I think they're doomed. But certainly, the ocean is a big place, and life in the oceans will go on no matter what happens with the climate, and actually no matter what happens with humanity. It's not going to destroy life on Earth. Life on Earth has persisted and changed and adapted through climate swings as big as anything that we're looking at right now. And the threat to civilization is really among the bigger threats of climate change. Yeah.
What do you think, though, about, taking climate change into consideration when dealing with those other factors, like for things like, fisheries management, for example? Like, what if you set a quota and you're like, okay, we can,
Well, you have to adapt. Obviously, you need to keep adapting, and you need to keep changing. You can't just use the same models that say that the reproductive potential of a certain organism is what it was in the 1950s if the survival is greatly affected or the range shifts or a lot of things change. You obviously need to keep changing and adapting your understanding and your management approaches to things as they are changing. But like if you're working on, let's just say, sea turtle conservation, and one of the things you're interested in is buying nesting beach habitat and securing it, you have to at least be asking yourself, will that beach be there if you just get from the high tide line out, or from 50 meters inland, because that's where they all nest and that's what you buy, and you don't buy the other half mile. Have you actually saved them for the foreseeable future? You have to think about those kinds of things.
You mentioned before cultural challenges for some of these environmental issues, and I actually wanted to ask you if you would comment on one specifically, shark finning. I think it'd be a big cultural issue. It's mostly like an ancient Chinese practice. Do you know much about it, or could you comment on maybe ways to go about tackling that problem?
I'm extremely culturally insensitive to some of those problems, and that's one of them. I think that I was talking a little earlier in the day about people who live in southeastern Indonesia, just south of the main island of New Guinea, who believe that the leatherback turtle is their ancestor who comes to provide food for them, and that when they see leatherbacks come in, they actually honor their ancestors' intent by killing and eating the turtles. That's the kind of thing that I think that requires a cultural understanding and cultural sensitivity, and you need to somehow explain effectively that we need to seek another way of honoring ancestors, because I don't think you can quite go in and say, you're wrong, that's ridiculous, you're superstitious. We have plenty of superstitions that we live by here, and that requires a sensitive approach. Otherwise, you will simply fail. But things like shark fins in the soup of business people who are just trying to impress their friends, I don't even think that that's any kind of like ancient cultural tradition.
I think it's used on the wedding day as part of the feast, the shark fin soup. For
Yeah.
like an auspicious wedding.
Well,
I mean,
that,
I'm not saying they should
that,
do
and,
it,
that,
but
and,
yeah,
that, and,
yeah.
and other occasions like that, yes. But I don't think that requires deep cultural sensitivity. I think it just requires a shift away from that practice and explaining that, it's very damaging. You're running out of sharks. You're not going to be able to do this, and the price has to adjust. The supply has to adjust. At this point, the populations have to recover because they are running out and running down. And I think that the approach that group Wild Aid, it's an NGO, has taken, where they're getting pop stars and athletes in China to just say no to shark fin soup and that kind of thing. I think that that's great. I think that's very effective. I don't think it requires tiptoeing around people's deep-seated cultural sensitivities. It's just something that they have a long tradition of having at parties and feasts, and the world you just can't keep doing it because you're going to run out soon.
Well, England used to eat green turtle soup.
So did we in the 1960s. Yeah. And that thing about like turtle recipes in Hawaii, that's another thing about ancient traditions and these things. That if it just cannot be sustained, it just cannot be sustained, and you have to find a respectful way of explaining that to people. But I don't think you're bound to commit somehow to continue to practice, or worse, to say, okay, this is your tradition. We have nothing to say here as outsiders. I think that kind of, I guess it's called cultural relativism, I think is misplaced.
I wouldn't argue with any of that at all. I guess maybe I should rephrase my question and say more. I think traditional ways of getting the word out might just be taken offensively, and I think it might do more harm than good. As someone who has experience trying to convey things that people don't want to hear about, say, fish stocks, do you have any specific ideas about how you get that word out to somebody like the Chinese who really don't want to hear it? If that were on my list,
well, I think you need the best way is to somehow go along a little chain of, like that game Telephone, where like one person says to the person next to them, says to the person next to them. It eventually needs to get to somebody who is a trusted source of information from within the culture, sort of like one of the people I'm working with now on this climate change thing with the Christian evangelicals, he didn't believe climate change, and he couldn't stand Al Gore, and he didn't want to have anything to do with it. He didn't think it was a religious issue at all, and he thought the world is getting warmer, so what? That has nothing to do with religion. But another pastor dragged him to a conference where a scientist who is an evangelical Christian who has done a lot of climate change work gave a presentation on climate change. So these were trusted sources of information that he was traveling with and that he was hearing it from. And so he was simply more open to hearing it from them because they were sort of pre-screened in his mind. And I think that all of us work that way to a certain extent, some to a great extent, some to a lesser extent.
Just to add a little, I know on the shark fin thing, there's a private company that's developing an artificial shark fin.
Fake crab.
And it's like, an artificial shark fin that will be just as good for soup making.
Yeah, it's called flour.
Like they don't eat the fin. It's like it makes.
It's a thickener.
Gelatinous.
It's a thickener in chicken and beef stock.
So they use I think it was a beef gelatin, to make a fake shark fin. And they were I know it was just recently they were launching it in China. So, I mean, I don't
I
know if it'll take
haven't
off.
heard
but
that. I haven't heard that.
yeah, I don't know if it will really take off, but maybe you know, if there was a big campaign.
Part of it, I think, has to do with the idea of, you know, like being able to get some of the powers of the shark by eating the shark fin soup. So I don't know if fake powers will work. You never know. You know, there is Viagra after all. Yes.
I have a question about, I just wanted to know your thoughts on aquaculture, especially offshore aquaculture, because it's new and up and coming in this new industry that the U.S. is talking about. And I guess particularly for finfish species like tuna and cod that are on the big decline, and maybe if we don't have something like aquaculture, they're going to disappear in a few years. Yet aquaculture has some really bad environmental effects. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, clearly there are trade-offs, and I think that it was a good thing for bird conservation to stop selling wild ducks and wild shorebirds and wild cranes and selling just chickens that are grown on farms. But I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. I hate seeing. I've been to places where the bays were completely full of pens and nets and aquaculture facilities. And here we have had for a long time this idea that below the high tide line is the public domain. The idea that it will become the private domain of farmers who will necessarily simplify areas and habitats, add things to the water, come into conflict with natural predators, be shooting fish-eating birds and fish-eating mammals and things like that is very distressing to me. I would much, much rather that we well manage fish supplies that are wild and we continue to use and enjoy them to the extent that they're capable of producing. But there will be a lot of aquaculture. I feel that the rush toward aquaculture by the Fisheries Service is the same kind of rush as developing fisheries that proved to be not very well thought out, and ultimately why they can't really do it anymore and they want to grow fish. The idea of growing in captivity these big carnivores that will require fishing gigantic amounts of forage fish out of ocean ecosystems is, also really, it'll be more layers of trouble and disruption, I think, compared to my vision of what it should be, which is well-managed wild fisheries. But there will be better ways of doing it and worse ways of doing it. I think that on-land contained aquaculture and growing fish that can be grown on mostly vegetarian diets is better. I've seen some very impressive demonstration projects of some of that kind of thing recently. And the other thing is that we have been able to enjoy, just like they enjoy all these different kinds of waterfowl and different kinds of wild meat and everything, we've been able to enjoy a huge diversity of seafood. And if we really did aquaculture in a very responsible way, we'd have far fewer species available, and everything would get simplified and incorporated. But I think that's almost a necessary trade-off. The trade-off of packing the world with so many people that you just have to suffer the consequences. But there's going to be a lot of aquaculture. I'd rather see it done better than done worse. I don't like the inshore aquaculture bothers me even more than the offshore. But all of it will have some consequences that I will not feel very comfortable with. Yes?
One more general question. Just in terms of professional, the growing number of environmental professionals interested in conservation, where do you think you can have the most effect? Is it going to be in policy or management or research or communication with groups like the religious leaders? Where do you think? Is it just going to be a balance?
No, I really, really think that you individually will have the most effect doing something that matches your talents and your interests. You know, if I said to you, the most effect is people who write legislation, which at one time I believed, and you just hate doing that, and you're not interested in law, then you personally won't have the most effect. You might not even stay in the field. And the idea of the most effect is not even a very effective way to ask the question, because so many different aspects all need to be worked on at once. You need lawmakers, you need communicators, you need scientists, you need people who work with children. You need all of these things. So the most important thing is to find the thing that fits with you, that really challenges and stretches you, but is not something where you browbeat yourself to force yourself to fit a preconceived idea of what is most effective, that is just not suited to your skills, abilities, talents, and desires. If I thought, for instance, as I once did, that policy is the most important thing to work on, and I moved to Washington, D.C. to work full-time on policy while living in the city, I just would have been very, very unhappy, and I may not have stuck with it at all. So I struck a balance that worked for me, and it allowed me to evolve into a different way of doing things with less emphasis on policy and more emphasis on communication. And living in a place where I, as basically a naturalist, basically, really what I am is I'm just a nature lover who likes to go fishing, where I can recharge my batteries very frequently, because if you're really involved in conservation work and you're reading all this bad news all the time, and you win a few big wins and you suffer a few big losses, sometimes you get really burned out and depressed. And for me, taking a walk on the beach in the morning with my binoculars and seeing that, it's mid-November and the gannets are arriving and stuff like that, it reminds me that the world is still alive. And sometimes I need that reminding. Or to go out in the fall when all the bluefish and striped bass are migrating, and to see, wow, this place is still loaded with fish, and that's really incredible. Because out of that context, I would probably just feel like really the world was just dying. And I would die along with it if that was my impression. So I need to live in a place where I can recharge. That's just important to me. It's not important to some other people I know who, they just thrive on policy. They love law. They love debating people who disagree with them in courtrooms and stuff like that. They get their charge out of that. I don't. I just don't. I've done a lot of it at times, and I think it's been important and it's been good for me, and it's helped the cause a little bit, but you just have to figure out what it is that you can do.
The only addendum I'd add to what Carl said is, when you pick out your niche, which I agree with totally, make sure you can talk to the people in the other niches, because doing marine conservation is about fulfilling your expertise, but also being able to communicate with these other people. And one of the problems we've had is scientists can only talk to other scientists. And they can't talk to policy geeks or governance geeks or education geeks.
I think that's a very, very key point that I failed to even mention in answer to Mary's question, which is one of the places that things are going is that we don't have the luxury anymore of just working within the niches of certain specialties. And there will be a role for that, and there will be people who just will have to do that kind of thing. But one of the things that really, really is needed is people who understand their specialties very well and can explain it very well, so that other people can benefit maximally from the work in those specialties. I've frequently seen scientists in management meetings or meetings at hearings with fishermen just do such a terrible job of explaining science that it just inflames people, because partly because at times their use of jargon gave people the complete opposite impression to what they were trying to say, because they use ridiculous words. Like I came across a thing yesterday in a manuscript that I was working on. there's a sort of a legalistic term or phrase, the use of the word disinterested, that scientists should conduct disinterested reviews of the management. Now that's a stupid way of putting it.
I mean, do you think?
And I've actually seen people get very, very upset about that. There was a big lawsuit, and I forget the details now, but the judge decreed that he had decided in a certain way because one side was making the argument from a disinterested standpoint, which enraged the other side, which understood it to mean that those persons weren't even interested, but the judge sided with them anyway. The whole thing was completely dumb. Yes.
Oh, I mean, do you think one way of combating that would be for something like every master's and PhD student has to take a required course on, communication and, like we have like a module that we have to take, which is like 2 hours on like PowerPoint, and then there's another one on like public speaking that says, don't say and don't say like. But I mean, do you think it would be helpful to have actually a course on how to communicate effectively, like a journalist would have, or a writer, something like that?
Well, I like to think that it would. I think a course is one thing, and a course can be very helpful. Even one lecture on certain key points can be very helpful. Key points in writing or key points in communicating can be very helpful. But it's something that you just have to continually practice in everything that you do. You can't just learn how to give a PowerPoint presentation effectively and write really badly in your term papers or your science papers. It's communicating is really, really fundamentally important in everything, in science, in policy, in telling the plumber what's wrong over the phone, in your marriage or whatever you have. If to the extent to which you are a better communicator and know how to put things so that what you mean to say comes across to the audience you're talking to, just makes everything much better and much more effective. So it's something that needs to be continually kept in mind and practiced. Not like, okay, in this course we're communicating. In this course I just have to get the paper done as fast as possible.
Yes, we do need to hit the road back to the coast soon, so we don't get stuck in the 5 o'clock traffic. How about one more question?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on the prospect of the U.S. signing the law of the sea?
Well, that's really such a bizarre thing. The U.S. won't has refused to sign the law of the sea for decades now, and even the Bush administration wants the law of the sea signed. But there are we'll talk about reactionary people who don't understand that much, but there are still some incredibly reactionary senators who feel that this is a threat to our sovereignty. And they believe that U.S. sovereignty means doing whatever you want anywhere in the world, which is really a losing proposition for our interests, I would say, our prestige in the world, our sense of being the moral light of the world, which has certainly dimmed very considerably in the last few years. And I think it's just very foolish that we have not signed the law of the sea and joined the rest of the world. But that is the reason. The reason is some right-wing people in Congress who don't want the U.S. to be constrained in any way anywhere in the world. And they don't want to give in to this idea of cooperation.
Do you ever just want to move to Canada?
I want to do a brief commercial for Carl, since he won't do it himself, and that is that he's written 3 wonderful books. If you don't have them, you should buy them. Song for the Blue Ocean, Eye of the Albatross, and Voyage of the Turtle.
And did you tell him Christmas is around the corner and
Yeah.
only $10?
Well, he brought 2 boxes of books over to the undergraduate course, and they almost bought them all, actually. So
You don't want to be outbought by undergrads.
he has a few copies of the Turtles book, which is the most recent, and of course my favorite. What he's offered to do is make any of those books available to you in paperback for a low $10, which is
Our cost.
Basically at his cost and pay off the cover price. So if you have interest in any of those, he has a few copies of the Turtle book that he doesn't want to carry back to New York. And you could pick up one now, or if you want to pick up any of the others, you just need to get in touch with Mary over here, Mary, because Mary is going to collect orders over the next few days, and just with your $10 and how you want the book like inscribed, Dear Bertha, somebody's mom, signed Carl Safina. Best wishes, Carl Safina. We'll get those books shipped here and get them to you as soon as possible. So if you're interested, that would be great. It's wonderful reading. I need to tell a quick story on Carl, because when he was thinking about the Turtle book, we talked, and I felt like some kind of co-conspirator or something in his book, and cheered him on. And then just before the book came out, he brought the galley copy, his last only galley copy that he had. It looked like the whole book put together, and I said, of course you're going to leave this with me. And he said, oh no, it's the only one I've got, and I really, I need to show some other people. And I kept insisting, and finally he left it with me, and then I got busy and didn't read it right away, and it was like a month later I finally sent him an email. I think I read it when we went to Hawaii with the class, but anyway, I sent him this long email just how much I loved the book, and he said, I thought you hated it, you hadn't responded for weeks.
You have no idea how relieved I was.
He was deeply hurt because I didn't read it right away, and I apologize, sir, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book, and a quick read.
All right, well, thank you very much, everybody.